Hey, this is Daryl Henry with Insurance for Entrepreneurs, and this video is my framework for analyzing workers' compensation insurance. At the end of this video, you should be able to take a look at your insurance policy and see if it's put together correctly and if there's any obvious ways to reduce costs. If you want to see the blog post, it's at insuranceforontrepreneurs.net. All right, let's get into it. So, the first thing that you should look at are states of operation. God bless America. Every state in America is different, has different laws, which means if you operate in a state, you have to make sure it's listed on your workers' compensation policy. The story I tell when I'm talking to people is I have a nonprofit client that before they were my client, they operated in Maryland and DC. They had been in both Maryland and DC for years, meaning they had offices and they had programming in DC. They had employees that lived and worked in DC. But DC was not listed on their workers' compensation policy. And so one day, an employee in DC got hurt. They tried to file a claim, and the workers' compensation company said, this state is not listed on the policy. It's not covered. And they had an uncovered workers' compensation claim because the states of operation on the policy were not correct. So there you go. First thing, you got to check, make sure all the states are there. Second, classification of work is important. So the way workers' compensation works is there's a couple key parts. One is what type of work do your people do? There are a lot of different classifications. It depends on which state you're in. Some states write their own classifications. For example, Pennsylvania and Delaware, looking at you, make it hard by having your own rules. But for the most part, in a lot of states, people follow the rules written by the National Council on Compensation Insurance. And they will write the rules and the descriptions, and they'll say, hey, for this type of work, so for example, a person that shows up, sits in an office, never leaves the office except to go home, their job duties are totally confined within those four walls of something like a lawyer's office or an insurance agent's office. That is clerical office work. Now, if you're a salesperson like me and you have to leave and go see clients, I no longer qualify for clerical. The description of my job duties have changed. So there is a classification for salesperson. And why is this important? Is because riskier work costs more to insure. It is more likely that I will get hurt in my job duties driving to and from appointments at client sites than somebody who goes and works in the office all day. And that's why it's important. And there can be, depending on what you do, there can be real nuances that can make a big difference in cost for you for workers' compensation insurance. And for me, one of my greatest triumphs as an insurance broker, and there's a separate blog post about it, is I worked with a mental health program that was improperly classified. I didn't change anything else about her workers' compensation program other than to make the argument the classifications should change, and that saved her 85% on her workers' compensation insurance. So it's really important that you pay attention. Second, the next thing, so this would be the third thing, would be payroll by classification. So workers' compensation is based off of job duties and how much those people get paid. So the classifications determine how risky the work is, and then the payroll determines how much of it there is. So why is this important? You have to make sure that the payroll is in the correct classification so that you're not paying too much. You also need to pay attention to uninsured subcontractors because they'll drive up your payroll. It's very, very important. So the story I tell in the blog post is I had a nonprofit. They went through an audit, and at the end of the audit, the insurance company was saying, "Okay, you owe us $20,000 because there was all this extra payroll." $20,000 was a lot of money. They were contesting it. They weren't happy with it. And where we landed on it was I said, "Okay, yes, that payroll's there. They had uninsured subcontractors. I can't do anything about that. However, you are classifying them in a social service classification. What if, since they work in an outpatient mental health clinic, let's put them in a doctor's office classification. It's 1/10 of the cost. The auditor said, that's a great idea because believe it or not, insurance companies don't want to screw you. They have people that work at them, and people don't want to be bad guys for the most part. And he looked at it and said, great, this works, checks all the boxes. I can say that I audited for the payroll, we collect the appropriate premium for it, and it follows the rules. And it saved my client $18,000 at that audit. The next thing to look at, so number 4, would be your experience modification factor. Workers' compensation is the one policy that you buy where you are directly compared against your peers based on your claims history. The experience modification factor is a pretty complicated formula, and it weights number of claims you've had versus how big those claims were and the type of work you do. What it boils down to is 1 is average. If you have an experience modification factor over 1, you're going to pay more than your peers. And if it's under 1, you're going to get a discount. So if you're looking at your policy and you see that you have an experience modification factor of 1.25, that means you're paying 25% more for workers' compensation insurance just because of your claims history, which means you got to take a look back inside of your operations and see if there's anything that you can fix in order to reduce those claims so you can get your experience modification factor down. And then number 5, scheduled debits or credits by underwriting. And it's written right there on the policy. And this is totally up to underwriter discretion, where they've got a range that they can apply, where they can apply more because they think that you present more of a risk, or they can apply less because they think you apply less of a risk. And the thing is, you have to stay on top of that because underwriters will use this to lessen the pain when your experience modification factors goes up, but then they'll leave that pricing on when your experience modification factor comes down. So it's a lever that's used to either lessen the pain or moderate the pain. But if you have earned the best possible pricing because you've had no claims, you've done it consistently over a long period of time, it's important to pay attention to that line item to make sure that the underwriting is not taking more money from you than they should. So that's my framework. Those are the 5 things I look at when I look at every single workers' compensation policy. And I find that if I go through that checklist, if there's an obvious way to reduce costs, I'm going to identify it. Or if there's a problem in the policy, I'm going to identify it by going through that framework. If this is helpful, hit like, subscribe for more content like this, share with your friends. I really appreciate you watching. If you want my contact information, it's at my website, insuranceforentrepreneurs.net. And always, go build something great.